Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep into this debate about the recent conflict in Gaza. Specifically, was Israel's response justified? We got this YouTube debate you guys sent in between Eylon Levy, he's arguing yes, and Mehdi Hasan. He's pretty firmly on the no side. This one gets pretty intense, so get ready. We're gonna uncover some stuff you probably haven't heard before.
Yeah, it gets pretty heated, and this isn't just about picking a side. This is about really getting into the heavy stuff,
Yeah.
Like the legal arguments and the ethics of it all. Things like how do you even measure proportionality in war? What about civilian casualties? And what does occupation even mean in this context? So let's break it down and see if we can find some of the nuance that gets lost in all the shouting.
Okay, so both sides agree that the Hamas attacks on October 7th were absolutely horrific. But Levy takes it a step further, right? He compares it to 9/11, even the Holocaust. I mean, what's the point of that comparison?
Well, it's a pretty powerful way to start, He's drawing a direct line between those events and the Hamas attacks, to really drive home the point about how bad the violence was and how they were intentionally targeting civilians. It's like he wants to make it clear that this wasn't just another attack. This is a total game changer, and it needs a totally different kind of response.
That makes sense. And it's not just an emotional appeal either, right? He's citing international law, military experts, all.
Oh, absolutely. He wants to show that Israel is acting by the book, within the rules of war and accepted military practices.
Okay, so where does Hassan disagree? He condemns the attacks too, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No question about that. But his point is, even the most horrible acts don't give you a free pass to just respond however you want. He keeps bringing up the huge death toll in Gaza, the destruction, the suffering of the people there. And he uses very specific cases to make his point.
The bombing of the Aldo's family apartment building, for example.
Exactly. 15 people killed, 7 of them children. He uses this as a test case. Is wiping out Hamas, even if you could, worth that kind of collateral damage? And that brings us to the core of this whole thing, right? This idea of proportionality in war.
Because Levy's whole point is that Israel's actions are proportionate. Given the existential threat, he says, Hamas poses. He's always talking about how they want to destroy Israel, how they use civilians as human shields.
Right, but Hasan really digs into the weeds of international law here. He's saying proportionality isn't just about the scale of the threat. It's about the methods you use in response. Did Israel really do everything they could to avoid civilian casualties? He also questions whether everything Hamas does is automatically an existential threat that needs such a massive response, even if their long-term goal is to destroy Israel.
So it's about more than just what's happening right now, right? It's about long-term goals and strategies. And what I found interesting is how Levy's position on Hamas kind of changes throughout the debate. At first, he's talking about destroying them, but then it shifts to removing them from power.
That's a big difference, right? Destroying Hamas sounds like complete annihilation, while removing them from power is more about weakening them, taking away their control.
Yeah, when he compares it to the fight against ISIS, he's saying Hamas, like ISIS, could be crippled as a governing force. So is he saying the goal isn't to kill every single Hamas member, but to stop them from actually running Gaza?
That seems to be where he's going with it. But Hasan isn't buying it. He says even Israeli military experts will tell you that destroying Hamas completely is just not possible. And he brings up some quotes from former Israeli officials that hint at a much bigger goal, something like resettling Gaza.
Resettlement, that sounds kind of ominous. What does he mean by that, and where's he getting this information?
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. He's looking at past statements, policies, things that suggest a long game from Israel, to weaken Hamas's control, maybe by actually moving the population. It's a super controversial idea, and we'd need to really dig into the evidence he's using to support it.
It's getting complicated. We've got these short-term goals, the response to October 7th, but then maybe there are these long-term goals, like totally changing who's in charge in Gaza. It's a lot to take in.
It is. And it gets even more complicated when you add in the human element, right?
Yeah.
We can't forget about the hostages taken during the attacks, and that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. So Levy, is arguing that Israel's main goal is to get those hostages back. And he really contrasts their efforts with how Hamas is treating those captives, supposedly really badly. And he even points to times when Israel actually got some hostages freed during a ceasefire.
So he's making Israel look like the good guys, right? The compassionate ones trying to save these innocent people, while Hamas is the heartless jailer.
Yeah, that's the story he's telling. But Hasan, He's not buying it at all. He even suggests that Israel might be using the hostages, as like a bargaining chip.
Hold on, really? What makes him think that?
Well, he brings up these reports saying that Netanyahu's government actually turned down a deal to get the hostages back. And he even mentions like criticism from the hostage families themselves, saying they feel like their loved ones are being used, to help Israel get what they want.
Wow, that's messed up. So now it's not just about military strategy, right? You've got real people's lives caught in the middle of this whole political fight.
Exactly. And this is where the whole legal definition of occupation becomes really important to the debate.
Because Levy's saying Israel isn't occupying Gaza anymore, right?
All right.
They pulled out their settlements back in 2005.
Right. That's his position. But Hasan's like, no way. He's saying Israel still controls all of Gaza's borders, the airspace, even who's allowed to be a citizen.
So even though there are no Israeli soldiers in Gaza, he's saying they're still calling the shots in other ways.
Exactly. And he backs this up by pointing to the International Court of Justice. They just came out and said, yeah, Gaza is still occupied territory.
So it's not just Levy and Hasan arguing their opinions, right? You've got actual legal experts weighing in on this. And it sounds like this debate isn't just between these two guys. It's happening inside Israel, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Actually, during the debate, there's this journalist, Peter Beinart. He's really plugged into the region. And he points out that even top Israeli officials have been contradicting each other about journalist Dino Baydallah, the one with family in the West Bank. He really calls Levy out. Can't you see the Palestinians as human beings? Isn't there anything the Israeli military could do that you would criticize? He's basically saying maybe Levy can't see how bad it is because he's dehumanizing the other side. Levy's response is interesting. He does point to times when Israel has admitted they messed up, that they were responsible for civilian deaths.
But he also says Hamas is forcing Israel's hand, right, by using civilians as human shields.
Right. But then Hasan jumps in and says, come on, you're cherry picking. You're ignoring the fact that this is happening systematically.
And that it amounts to war crimes, maybe even genocide. That's a heavy accusation.
He throws out some pretty disturbing numbers, too, over 16,000 children killed in Gaza since this whole thing started.
Wow. Yeah, that really hits home. All those innocent lives lost. And it brings us back to that idea of proportionality, right? Even when you're fighting a brutal enemy, how much collateral damage is too much?
And it's not just about the big picture. They go back and forth about specific incidents, too, like the bombing of that Aldo's family apartment building.
Where Levy keeps saying Israel does everything they can to avoid hurting civilians. But Hasan's like, if that's true, why won't they tell us what happened? It just looks like they don't care about Palestinian lives. It's like both sides are trying to spin the story their way,
They are. And it's not just happening on the battlefield. It's like an information war, too. Levy's accusing Hasan and other critics of, spreading fake news.
And trying to turn the world against Israel.
Yeah. He says they're making things sound worse than they are just to make Israel look bad.
But Hasan's saying, no, Levy's the one gaslighting us. He's downplaying how many civilians are dying and trying to shift the blame away from Israel.
He says Israel is trying to paint Hamas as this uniquely evil force, to justify anything they do, no matter how many Palestinians get hurt.
This is getting pretty intense. It kind of feels like the debate itself shows how divided everyone is.
Totally. And it gets super awkward sometimes. Like when Hasan wouldn't answer a question from a New York Post reporter.
Because he doesn't like Rupert Murdoch, the guy who owns the paper. Wow. I guess even a debate can turn into a total circus. It's hard to tell what's real and what's just personal bias.
And then it gets worse. Levy accuses Hasan of taking money from Qatar for his new media company. Of course, Hasan denies it.
Man, it's like everyone's pointing fingers. It's hard to have a real conversation when nobody trusts each other.
And it's not just about money either. They're calling each other hypocrites, too. Hasan brings up how Levy used to work for the Israeli government under Netanyahu.
The same Netanyahu who's now facing war crimes charges.
Yep. Hasan saying, how can you defend Israel now after working with him?
But Levy defends himself. He says he always put his country first. And he supports what they're doing in Gaza because he thinks it's necessary, to protect themselves.
And he says the ICC's charges against Netanyahu are just politically motivated, that they don't have any real evidence. He even implies that the court itself has something against Israel.
It's wild how even these institutions, like an international court, can get dragged into the fight.
And it's not just the ICC. They argue about the UN, too, and all these humanitarian groups.
Levy says they're all biased against Israel and their information is wrong. But Hasan's using their reports to show how bad things are in Gaza and how the world needs to step in and do something.
It really shows you how hard it is to just look at the facts. Even the numbers can be spun in different ways depending on what you already believe and who you support.
Yeah, and that's what makes this whole debate so difficult. It's not just about being right or wrong. It's about these really deep questions about what's right and wrong, period. About the law. About justice.
Absolutely. This isn't a simple problem, and if we get it wrong, the consequences could be huge for everyone.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how messed up things can get, how people can be so violent, and some of these conflicts, it feels like they'll never end. But it also shows you how important it is to really think for yourself, right? To look at the evidence, even when it makes you question things you thought you knew for sure.
That's a really good point. And what's interesting is even though they're fighting like cats and dogs, both Levy and Hasan actually agree on one thing. This has got to stop.
Yeah.
They both know how much it's costing, in terms of human life. And they both say there needs to be a way to get to some kind of peace.
But how do you even start when it seems like they want such different things? Levy's saying Israel can't back down when it comes to security. They have to take out Hamas, even if it means civilians get hurt.
And Hasan's countering that, saying all they're doing is creating more terrorists, not getting rid of them. He's saying, look, the only way to be safe is to find a political solution, one that deals with the root causes of the conflict.
So it comes down to, this moral question, right? Is it ever okay to do this much damage to innocent people, even if you say it's self-defense?
That's a question people have been wrestling with forever. And this debate, it really throws it in your face. It's not an easy question, and if we get the answer wrong, it could be really bad.
This whole thing makes you wonder about the decisions leaders make and how it affects people on the ground. Normal people just trying to live their lives.
And you see this happening in other conflicts too, right? It's this global struggle. Some people think security is all that matters, and other people say, no, human rights and the law, those have to come first, even during a war.
So where does that leave us? This has been a deep dive into a really, really complicated situation, and we definitely haven't found all the answers.
Yeah, we haven't. But I think we've looked at all the main arguments from both sides. So hopefully, you understand the issues better. Now it's up to you. What do you think? Was Israel's response justified? Or is Hasan right that it might just make things worse in the long run?
Think about what this all means for the future. Not just for the people in Gaza, but for Israel too. How safe are they? What about their image in the world? This isn't over, not by a long shot. And we all have to keep thinking about these questions as we try to figure out what's going on.
One thing that stood out to me, even though they're fighting so hard, both Levy and Hasan, they both actually want peace. Even if it seems impossible right now. Maybe, just maybe, that's where we have to start with that hope. Maybe that can help us find a way to talk to each other, in a way that actually makes sense, a way that recognizes everyone's suffering and reminds us that we're all human beings.
Yeah, it's a tough goal. But it's the only way to stop the violence. We have to find a way for Israelis and Palestinians to live together in peace. So as you learn more about this conflict, try to see past the headlines, look for the human stories, and most importantly, be open to understanding both sides. We have to find solutions that respect everyone.